reliable. That's the only way you can blend the two. You can't say absolutely positively, I believe both of them, because then you have a contradiction. You cannot have that. If you say you fully believe the Bible is the Word of God, and you believe the account in Genesis, then you cannot mix it with evolution. But if you say that evolution is right, and the Bible could be some sort of myth in the first 5 to 8 books of Genesis, well, then you can start a little bit of blending, if you would. And that's what some individuals have done. So let's come forward here to, we passed it. Right. Not quite. There's that one, and here we go. This is where we're actually picking up there on page number 2 of this lesson. All right, so let's say for the sake of argument, we're going to take the position of theistic evolution. That means that God started the Big Bang. God let through the course of billions of years, the earth finally developed, and God allowed the accidental spark, maybe He caused the spark, and then He allowed the evolutionary process to take place. Well, here's a big question. Where was Adam in all this? The Bible clearly says that God made man, and He called him Adam, and He made his wife, and called her Eve, and it clearly says that the first man, Adam, became a living being. This is what Paul believed. This is what Moses believed. This is what Jesus believed. And looking back and talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, was asking, what is written from the beginning and everything. So those individuals believed in the Genesis account that had Adam being the first living being. But if we're going to accept and say that God used the evolutionary process to bring man into being, where was Adam? Because based on the way they speculate, it was probably several million years before Adam finally stood up and found his wonderful wife. Because think about it, through the whole evolutionary process, by the time you got there, wouldn't there have been many, many people or some semblance of people? But the Bible paints a different picture. The Bible states Adam was the first man. And if you're going to believe in theistic evolution, you're going to have to say, well, at some point in the evolutionary process, God made Adam specifically. That's where God tweaked the genome in the evolutionary process and got man on the right track. I mean, you have to come up with something. If we're going to say that the way that Genesis reads it did not happen, and we have to say that if we're going to say evolution did happen. The other one is theistic evolution cannot explain Eve. Where did Eve come from? Well, the Bible says God made Eve. Well, not technically. He did through the evolutionary process, and eventually through all the multiple changes of species, and finally, and He tweaked the genome of Adam. He had to, tweak the genome of the woman as well to match up with that. Maybe that's where Eve comes into the picture. But when you look at what the Bible teaches, the Bible again holds to the idea that God made woman from the man. Paul believed it. Jesus believed it. And if it was not true, then truly what were they putting their faith in? And if you believe Jesus is the Word, then how did the Word handle a mythical text and teach everybody as if it was authority? Jesus would know that Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 was false if truly evolution was the process that God used. But yet Jesus said, and from the beginning it was not so. Talking about it was not God's intent for a man to put away his wife. All right? God, and this is coming from Matthew chapter 19, I believe it is, when they start the questioning process there. And so if we're going to embrace theistic evolution, we have to come up with some sort of time period to drop Eve into that doesn't fit the Bible's accounts. Because even if we were to take the position that God used evolution, at some point, if you're going to hold the Bible to be true, God stopped the whole evolutionary process. Now let's do this whole garden thing and make man and woman properly and all the animals properly, and then we'll get history going. if we're going to hold to, if you want to hold to one theory, you really cannot hold to the other side. If you're going to hold completely to the Bible, you can't hold to evolution. If you're going to hold to evolution, you cannot hold to the Bible in the form that the Bible is in. You have to take a different approach to it, and then you no longer have the Word of God. Any thoughts or any comments? Yes, right there. That's exactly right. You can't do that. You cannot, and the same thing would apply here. You cannot serve both the Bible and evolution. At some point, you're going to say, well, something is not true, and I can't believe it. And some people who hold to theistic evolution pretty much have to view the Bible as mythical stories. And many religious people do. Many religious people view Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to the flood in 6, 7, and 8 as with mythology that was written down by the Hebrews when they were in the Babylonian captivity, incorporating the beliefs of other nations. Well, if you take that position, then you can accept evolution, I guess. Lamont. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And what do we do with that then? You know, do we chalk it up to figurative? Well, John misunderstood, and then everything goes out the window. Yeah, everything goes out the window. And it is equivalent to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. If there is no resurrection, then Jesus was not resurrected from the grave. And if Jesus was not resurrected from the grave, and here's the big paraphrase, what are we doing here today? Actually, we ought to go home. We of all men are most pitiable. That's exactly right. Yeah. Right there. Fundamentally, it depends on what position they hold. You know, agnostic or an atheist. Many of them will say we don't know. And that's what they end up to. Some will be bold enough to say, well, there's nothing after. We're dead all over like Rover. But again, at some point, they have to come up with something to believe because it's unprovable from their standpoint. Check. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. But it's like any other thing. If you go and twist what the Bible teaches, then you don't know what to believe, especially when it comes to life after death. What does the Bible teach? Is it valid? But if you're going to hold to from the beginning and put it all where it's supposed to be, then you have a solid basis for believing in eternity with God in heaven. You know, because in your mind it's not questionable because it's not questionable from the beginning. Everything is fully believable. How do they explain the problem of Eve? Some try to make the first 11 chapters of Genesis mythological or allegories. We talked about that. If the flood was mythological, how do they explain references to it by Jesus and Peter as being a real historical event? And we've kind of talked about that as well. So it's kind of like saying, well, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, but I also believe that the story of the flood really didn't take place. Well, then Jesus, the Son of God, was a little bit off or was propagating intentionally a lie. You kind of stop and think about that. Any other thoughts? All right, so the next section that we look at here in continuing showing the issues here is that theistic evolution cannot explain where man acquired his soul. Okay? At what point in the evolutionary process, again, theistic evolution, I believe in God, therefore I believe that man has a soul, and therefore I believe that man will spend eternity in heaven with God, but I also want to embrace evolution. So if Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 did not take place the way that it's recorded, then at what point in the evolutionary process did man obtain a soul? Doesn't answer the question. And for someone to step in, well, God eventually at some point gave man a soul, okay? How do you know that? If you can't believe the first 8 chapters of the Bible and you're choosing to believe this, how do you know that man has a soul? The whole basis for the faith that we have a soul is thrown out the window when you begin to unravel the beginning chapters of the Bible. The fact that man was created in the image of God. What point in the evolutionary process of all the pictures that they've depicted and everything, which one of those did God finally say, okay, you get to have a soul? Because if evolution truly took place that way, did the earliest organisms, that spark of life, is that what God gave a soul to? We have no answers to those questions. Unless we take what the Bible teaches us and hold to that, then we have answers to questions. And there's a lot of validity to why we should give credibility and credence to what we see within the Scriptures. Theistic evolution also logically denies the fall of man. Where did Satan come into the picture if theistic evolution is the case? When did Satan tempt man if it's only a mythological story and allegory in order to accept evolution? Is there even a Satan? And, when in Romans chapter 5, for by one man sin entered the world, and through sin death, and death spreads to all men, because all men sin. Wait a minute, that was a mythological story and allegory. When did that really take place? Theistic evolution does not allow for that. But yet, we want to believe in God, and at the same time, we want to believe in evolution. So we're going to merge the two and make a whole lot of assumptions because we've just thrown out the first 8 books of the Bible, or first 8 chapters of the Bible. And really, if you can't believe the first 8 chapters, how can you believe chapter 12 about Abraham? We've not found historical evidence that Abraham lived. We found the Ur of the Chaldees. Well, we archaeologists have found the Ur of the Chaldees. But at what point can you finally say, okay, now we're reasonably certain the Bible's talking about real people? Well, King David has been found evidence, so forth. You see the point, if you throw out the first 8 chapters, then what can you believe in? You cannot you cannot take position theistic evolution and still say that you believe the Bible is inspired by God. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, except the first 8 chapters. If we were to hold this position, which we do not. And I think I told you some years ago, we had a visitor come through back when we lived in Jonesboro, and he was telling me about, and I can't remember the guy's name who was holding the meeting, but they were having a special speaker come into their congregation. It was a conservative work as far as I knew, but this guy had an excellent lecture on how theistic evolution does work. And they were proud of it. Because it was going to be open-minded, it was going to be more modern and be able to merge 2 worlds that cannot be merged if we're going to follow what the Scriptures teach. All right, any thoughts or comments? Yes, right there. Well, it has to do with the age of reasoning, the last 500 years, the growth of science. And I'm not against science, don't misunderstand me. But there has been, over the last 300-400 years, a divide. And part of the divide that's been developing were held by religious believers who were ignorant when it came to truly what was being developed and what was learned about science. But then you've got those who, through scientific experimentations and then the theories that they put forth and so forth and so on, they go completely in an enlightened area, and for some reason, there's no room for the Bible to fit within that. For me, I've always believed that science and the Bible goes together. Where science is fact, the Bible will never alter it, they will never correct it, and they'll never correct the Bible. But it's when we get into theories, especially the one about how man began, that's when you see a direct conflict with the Bible. And some people choose to go this way. It's more enlightened way of thinking. The Bible's more of an archaic way of thinking. And see, the beauty of religion's all about faith. So you can start your own religion. Okay? There is I guess you'd call it a denomination. I'm not even sure if it is. But it's over in Edmond, and they've got a sign out front, something to the effect of religious education for adults and children. Now there's honesty there. They don't say Bible education, they say religious education. And this particular religious group teaches from just about every religion that exists. Teach a little bit of Buddha, a little bit of Hindu. If it's some sort of religious concept, they educate people in it. One preacher once said they don't know what they believe because they believe a little bit of everything. But if we're going to hold to what the Bible teaches, which is archaic, by the way we would view it, then we have to draw some lines. And people don't like to draw lines sometimes. Arthel. There's a website where you can go get ordained just real easily. You can do marriages, everything. The last thing here before we move on to the next section. This one right here, let's look at that. Uniformitarianism instead of catastrophism. Catastrophism. Honey, you want to explain that real quick? You don't have to. I'm kidding. We're going to read it. We will read this for clarity. So theistic evolution is wrong because the Bible teaches catastrophism. Evolution teaches uniformitarianism. Over and over again, the Bible speaks to us of catastrophic events. Think about the flood of Genesis 6 through 8, the plagues of Egypt, etc. The miraculous is an intrinsic part of the Bible. On the other hand, evolution requires uniformitarianism with its trite phrase, the present is the key to the past, as its watchword. Evolution states emphatically that all things are going on today just like they always have and always will. The Bible plainly denies this. Now, the significance of that is, again, trying to come up with some belief system that merges the Bible with evolutionism. And these two big old words that they've got up there says basically it can't be done because they are in direct contradiction to one another. All right, any thoughts or comments about what we've looked at up to this point as far as why a Christian, what would be wrong with trying to embrace evolution and the Bible and come to this understanding of theistic evolution? Several things we've looked at. Here in just a moment, we're going to consider some compromises that people have reached on this subject. Before we look at that, any other thoughts? All right, so let's look at some compromises real quick. I remember hearing this many, many years ago, and it's the concept of the day-age theory. It has to do with the Hebrew word that's translated as day in Genesis. It's the evening and the morning were the first day, the evening, morning, the second day. And there is a use of that Hebrew word that could refer to an indefinite amount of time period. But most of the time that word yom, as you'll see it there in the text, is used, it is used in reference to a 24-hour day. And it's hard to imagine that Moses would intentionally use the phrase, in the evening and the morning was the first day, if it wasn't the evening and the morning being the first day. Now, if that's not what it means, then we ask ourselves, well, how much of Genesis 1 and 2 can be taken literal if the reference to the days are not literal? And so the couple things there, let's see, the word translated day is we talked about that, refers to a period of both day and night. In non-prophetic Old Testament literature, Yom also always refers to a normal day. You look throughout the Old Testament, the way this word is used, it is used multiple times for a very specific day. But to make it fit, you think about what Peter says, 1,000 years is the day of the Lord, as a day is 1,000 years, or so forth. Well, there you go. Now we have evidence that the 6 days referenced in Genesis weren't 24-hour days. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And I like to think the other direction, okay? Let's say for the sake of argument, Moses gave us something that wasn't exactly right. In other words, Moses laid out the creation process so we would understand the whole, understand what God did. All right, so you've got one option. It really took the Lord billions of years to get us to this point. Or, why not say, if we believe in the power of God, he snapped his fingers, so to speak, and instantly everything came into effect. You know, if we're going to say the 6 days weren't 6 days, then why not go that route? Why not just say God did that and instantly everything, and Adam and Eve and the garden and everything was there? You know, well, it's because it's not what this teaches over here. And so people want to try to merge the two, and so we come up with this day-age theory. Any thoughts about that? I know sometimes days seem really, really long, but Chuck.
You can look at each of the 6 days. Every day was dependent upon the next day, or vice versa. There's not anything put over here in day 6 that could be survived by day 1. But every day supplied what is needed for that day and back to be free.
That's true. And something else to think about it. Kind of think about it this way. What did God make on the first day? He made light. What did God make on day 4? The sun, moon, stars, the Lord. You know the song. What did God make on the second day? Well, he did the firmament, right? And caused the dry land to appear. What did he make on day 5? The birds and the fish that live in the atmosphere and on the land there. So think about day 1, day 4, day 2, day 5. What did he make on day 3? He brought forth dry land on day 3. What did he make on day 6? Man and all creeping animals that live on the land. So it's this interesting imagery when you have days 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6. You know, it's very, you see a pattern, a method. It's very interesting, built up. Yes, sir.
How long do you think his spirit covered over the water? What's your opinion about that?
I'd have to say, I really, for as long as it needed to. I don't know, that's a good point. Where it talks about that God, the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the face of the deep. And see, that's the thing that we have to, and that's an interesting point, because is the first 2 verses part of the 6 days, or the first 2 verses stating what the Lord did before the beginning of the creation process? See, I have no problem saying the Lord created the world and everything in 6 days, but that doesn't do away with verses 1 and 2, you know. And if that makes sense, if you go back and look at it, 1 and 2, He created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, or the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the face of the deep. And then you hit, I think, verse 3, and we see that process of the creation of verses 1 through 6. Now, some preachers hold the position that verses 1 and 2 are part of the first day. I've heard others who say the first day starts with verse 3. So, short of that, I don't know. It's a good question. It's a good thought, though. Hannah.
Created like animal life, like we have the animal food chain and everything. But how important it is that man was made last. How man it was that put in charge. He was over the animals that he was made differently. But the fact that the order.
That's a good point. I was having a conversation with someone the other day about the intelligence of dolphins. And dolphins, I guess, are pretty intelligent. But who still dominates the world and has built cities and advancements and so forth? When everything's said and done, it still comes down to man. For as wonderful animals are, as smart as some of them may be, they are some incredibly smart ones. It's still man that God created the overall. All right, Arthur.
When we say God, we're talking about Father, Son, and Spirit, right?
You want to bring that into this thing?
But he started. When he said the Spirit was hovering over.
It does. Leo Bowles, in his book on the Holy Spirit, he views that as the first record of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament. The Spirit of the Lord hovering, basically. Because there's a number of times you'll see a reference to the Spirit of the Lord. And some about the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And then based on John, Jesus was there.
Right.
You know. And so it'd be, as best as we could understand, and there's been some discussion whether or not the term Godhead is an accurate use of the term. But from everything we see, all three were present at the creation of all this. Yes, sir.
I remember we had a Bible study a while back where, and, if you read it at part of in the original Hebrew language, it says in the beginning, Elohim, it stands for the powerful ones. In other words, it's plural.
Yep.
So when it says, yes, in the beginning God, it is insinuating, because remember at 1.2, you do also hear when it says, let us make man. So it makes you wonder, okay, well, who's God talking to in that time? Who was that in the beginning? But he said John supports that, and then also, was it First John, it says there were three that are reckoned in heaven, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they all agree in one.
1 John 5. Yeah, right around verse 7. So that's, and you're right, the plurality of the word, let us make man in our image, and the word translated as God. What I was taught is a plural term. Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right, let's look real quick about the gap theory. There we go, the gap theory. It was proposed in about 1814. It's been modified some throughout the years. It essentially goes like this, and you'll see the quote there in the lesson. The creation of the world by God, as recorded in Genesis 1:1, took place billions of years ago. I have come across some belief, by the way, who believe that there was a whole nother set of creatures living on the earth that God wiped out. They believe that when in the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth without form and void, and so forth. They believe that there was an initial creation of creatures that God utterly wiped out and restarted again with what we know to be day one. To me, the Bible doesn't support that, but it's something that some hold. Anyway, so the creation was then despoiled because of Satan's disobedience, resulting in his being cast from heaven with his followers. The cataclysm occurred at the time of Satan's rebellion and is said to have left the earth in darkness. So this is a variation of what I was saying. And they take it based on the word waste and void in one translation as a divine judgment because of the sin of Satan and rebelling against God. The world as God had created it with all its inhabitants was destroyed and left waste and void, which it is claimed accounts for the myriad fossils present in the earth. Then God recreated or restored the earth in 6 literal 24-hour days. The gap theory is intended to harmonize Genesis and geology on the ground of allowing vast periods of time between Genesis 1 and 1. So, and so forth. So instead of adopting the theistic evolution, we need to go and add just a little bit, so to speak, of time within the very beginning of the record. Genesis 1 and 2, and then jump forward a large period of time and then we start with Genesis chapter 3. The problem with this, when everything is said and done, there's just no evidence within the Scriptures to support it. It comes back to, well, it's a theory, and it helps to merge the two of them. But when everything is said and done, you have a mistranslation, the text points out. When you see waste and void, that's not the proper reference. It is without form and void, is what we see. And there's no evidence for Satan's rebellion being on earth, they make the point, or for a great cataclysm. We know that the angels left their first abode. We understand that. Jude kind of talks about that. But we have to add a lot to the Bible in order to come up with this particular concept. Quickly, let's go ahead to the next one. There is also the progressive creationism, and it's called a threshold evolution. And basically, this theory says that God directly created the first life and also the major stages of life as evolution occurred. We referenced that kind of in passing earlier. Because you'd have to kind of take that point that maybe he started evolution and then right here he stopped it, tweaked the genome and everything, and got man and all the major species that we know today started and on the right track. But then again, this is an idea, this is a theory. There are other compromises. Other theories have been concocted and proposed over the years to try to come up with a compromise. So many feel they have to make the compromise. They've got the modified gap theory, the non-world view of origins, multiple gap theories, and so forth. When everything is said and done, what is the safest course when it comes to talking about the creation of all things? If you're a Christian and you believe in God, you believe Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, then what is the safest and really the only position to take? What the Bible says. It's what the Scripture says. You know, if it didn't happen that way, well, then we'll find out one day. But Peter makes a point that there are many people. Paul wrote some things difficult to understand. And I've often found that interesting. And if an apostle writes about another apostle, that he's written things difficult to understand, it really makes you have to wonder just a little bit. But he says that some have twisted to their own destruction. So what does that say about twisting what the Bible teaches? Yeah, it's going to lead to our own destruction. And you can bring in Galatians 1, 6 through 9, and the warning there about teaching something other than what was brought. Let's see, I think there's one more chart here. So you've probably heard it said before, if you start wrong, you're sure to end up wrong. And this is certainly the case of theistic evolution. If you start with the presupposition that evolutionary concepts and its geological timetable are true, then you'll end up with a corrupted view of the biblical account of creation. If more people would honestly examine the evidence for evolution versus creation, I believe the author writes, they would abandon these compromised theories and accept God's plain revelation describing the true origin of all things. In the beginning, God created. Okay, I'm curious now, any thoughts or comments on what we looked at here with the problem with the theistic evolution? Blake. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. That's a good point. Both of them then begin to crumble, Yeah. That's true. That's a good point. Yes, sir. It's always possible. There's a lot of things that, and people will use this to argue against God. There's a lot of things that God has allowed that fundamentally will separate the wheat from the chaff. You know, I personally would not be surprised if what we were to find out is that, and I don't think, when we get to heaven, I don't think it's going to matter. I had a teacher years ago say, I can't wait to get to heaven. I got a bunch of questions for Moses, and and I'm thinking, I got a feeling it won't matter. None of those are going to matter, but I believe, and we believe that God made the heavens and the earth. So, not just heavens and the earth, the universe. So, whatever we discover of light, we're discovering what God has made. And they talk about the distance it takes from the light from the stars. For God, it would be like a kid drawing a line on a piece of paper. When He created all things, He could very easily stretch out, whether they're particles or waves, however you position, He could have easily stretched every single one out to the right position. He could make the earth full grown. Now, I do believe dinosaurs lived. So, I think the fossils are actual fossils. But it could be that He, in His infinite wisdom, knew at some point man would choose to worship the creation more than the Creator. And it serves, you referenced 2 Thessalonians, where He would send them a strong delusion. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? And to me, that's why I like science. Science is just discovering this whole black hole thing, that they've taken pictures of. All they're doing is discovering and uncovering more stuff that God has created. Now it's their interpretation and their theories they base on it, but that's the problem. But yeah, Arthel. Yeah. That's right. Sometimes the truth is just boring when you've known it long enough and something's more excited. That's why a man gets in trouble if he looks at a younger woman. You got to be constant. But you understand the point. I mean, it's something you get comfortable with it, and it's not as exciting as it once was when you first became a Christian. And you see all these people getting excited over other things. Well, we've got the Israelites looking at the other nations. And to that end, in Acts chapter 7, and we'll get to this here, hopefully maybe this week or next week in our Acts study. And Stephen is reviewing the history of the children of Israel in his defense before the council there. If you'll notice there, when we come down to let's see. There in verse 39, where we have just prior to that, he talks about the Lord had given the living oracles to the children of Israel, or to Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. And he says, our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us, etc. And so they did. Look at verse 42. But God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. Then he quotes from Amos chapter 5, verse 25 through 27. But I like the way Stephen says that. And same thing, we're talking about God gave them up to worship whatever they want to do. Faith is a choice. And God doesn't force us. It requires a conviction, a persuasion. We need to be thoroughly persuaded in what we believe. And when it is something that we believe by choice, then it's a true belief. And if we're not going to believe that, He'll let us believe whatever we want. But it's not without consequence, of course. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. All right, I think it's time for that last bell. Okay. Let's go ahead and plan the next Wednesday. And I was asked earlier what we're going to study after this. I'm not certain yet. Still trying to answer that question. But next week, let's look at lesson number 13, and we're going to look at some discussions about what about the age of the earth and different thoughts regarding that. What about the flood? Some arguments for and against that, and what about dinosaurs? And this is all a curse review. The material at the end, the supplemental material, where I got the actual lesson from the church in, where was it? The Rice Road Church of Christ in Tyler, Texas. They had on the church's website links to a bunch of supplemental material that I think the lessons were based upon. And that just gives you extra reading that you can look at too if you haven't already done that. I appreciate all the participation and comments. Next week, last lesson 13.